Welcome back to a new episode of Things They Don't in Florida, a project initiated by Crimson Coast Dance in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island in the very west of Canada, as we know. And today we have Mårten Geoghegan with us from Gothenburg, where he is senior lecturer at the university there at the Department for Applied IT. We know each other from Berlin, where Bernard was busy earlier, living and working. However, at the same time being professor at King's University in London. Bernard has a background or takes an interest in relationships in between social sciences, cultural sciences, and their relationship to technology, and how, so to say, there is a flow of references and influence from both sides. From my sort of silly perspective, I thought somebody came up with computers and then we started to count, and then we started to use computers in order for something. But Bernard has pointed out in much more complex ways, of course, how perhaps computers were invented because they were needed in order for certain kinds of operations and more forms of control to take place. In 2023, Bernard published a book called Code from Information Theory to French Theory, 2023 on Duke, which has caught a lot of interest internationally, and for me was a very exciting book to look into in regard to a sort of way of looking into the history of techniques and technology, however, not with the conventional linear attitude from Babbage to over Turing to whatnot, but sort of snaking about and coming up with evidence for how forms of research took place, how there were reactions in regard to funding structures, etc., and in different forms of institutionality. That was very eye-opening for me, who indeed had understood technology as a very linear kind of sort of situation. And I think what interests me as well is how his writing in regard to this unorthodox kind of relationships introduced is also pointing out forms of how technology has sort of perpetuated colonial practices in certain ways, how it has in understanding of information, how it is strongly Western, how it perpetuates gender binaries, etc., etc. So today I wanted to ask Bernard a few questions around his book and his current research that is interesting in regard to our project in Nanaimo in respect of how it deals with the understanding of territory and forms of navigation, orientation, etc., and its history for sure. First, cybernetics is something that we know from Norbert Wiener, but I'm afraid in the art world, cybernetics either has to do with prostheses of the body and have a rather negative tonality. How is your relationships, and how did you get into an interest in cybernetics?
Well, I think this is probably symptomatic or telling about how I ended up writing the book. Originally, I first encountered cybernetics reading people like Jacques Derrida, like Grammatology, a book from the 60s, and more recently Bernard Stiegler, writing in the 90s. Like, it would come up in kind of philosophical texts as some kind of high-tech idea of computing, feedback, communication, the way everything was becoming technical and informational. And then bit by bit, I kind of came to it again through histories of technology, where I found out there was a kind of big hype in the mid-20th century, where before people knew what computing was, like, well, it took a long time to decide what are these new technologies. And one of the things people were talking about them was not computers as in terms of calculations, but computers more in terms of like Um, it could be giant brains. It could be the body as a system, like so the computer is like a brain, or bodies are like computers. Computers are like bodies. And to me, it was really fascinating that at the early stage of computing, it wasn't just engineers and mathematicians talking about what these devices were. It was lots of anthropologists like Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, neurologists like Warren McCulloch. And so to me, cybernetics, this isn't exactly what I say in the book, but I guess what I'll say now. Cybernetics was the name for a certain kind of scattering and dispersion and plurality of interests that didn't just respond to computing, but somehow were involved in early aspirations and ideas for what machine technology, automated machines, informational machines would do. Because in 1945, once you knew machines could process information, it wasn't quite clear. Is this an engineering problem? Is this like a librarian's problem? Is it a question for anthropologists who study cultural systems? Like nobody really knew. And cybernetics was this hip, kind of buzzy, oftentimes ridiculous word where all these people talk together.
If one would sort of travel backwards from 1945, is there a relationship in between the sort of the birth or the birth and the development of statistics and the need for apparatuses that understand larger populations, for example?
Yeah. So yeah, this is a huge topic which people a lot smarter than me have written about. You know, Ian Hacking, Michel Foucault. Um, so like so Ian Hacking, this historian of science, writes about what he calls the avalanche of printed numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in the course of the 18th and 19th century, particularly the French state, but also like insurance companies, are just gathering more. Oops, hold on.
You're welcome.
They're gathering more and more, they're writing more and more stuff down numerically just to keep track of, both to manage the state, but also like if you're an insurance adjuster to figure out like how likely is it that a building's going to burn down. And you just have to keep track of enough buildings that and eventually you can quantify it. Um, so this birth of you gradually have the birth of statistics that are you could say it's about dealing with problems at scale. No human can
Mm-hmm.
observe all the problems, but you can count them. Uh, and then, for example, in the topic I work on, this rise of statistics, say for political and social purposes, also ends up being involved in like new ways of understanding how do you efficiently transmit data. So like telegraphy, right? Like telegraphy, the very elementary example is like um, the representation of a common letter like E has a very simple sign, and a more
Mm-hmm.
complex sign like Z has a more complex less common sign like Z has a more complex representation in telegraphy. And there's frequencies that determine efficient rules of communication, which gradually feed into information theory, cybernetics, and like the early computing and its connection to communication and its connection a little bit to things like the census.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But and at what time, or how do you see then the relationships to the coming of of computers as machines in regard to statistics? Is there statistics needed computers? Is that a way of understanding it?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a way of understanding it. You'd say like uh um trying to think modern complex societies have a lot of challenges in governance, right?
Mm.
So I would sort of say something like modern governance needed statistics, and out of that, it also eventually needed things like computers. Um, and so you sort of, and the other thing is like to invent computers, you need a certain sort of large scale organized scientific research apparatus
Mm.
that, partly relates to like not only, but partly relates to like modern nation states that can rally resources and can rally, particularly in industry, in new types of ways to produce machines and science that give rise to computers. But
Hmm.
you can't really tease the computer apart from problems of governance.
Hmm. I think there is a there's a grand narrative in regard how computers entered society, and a particularly strong one is World War II and the ciphers and decoding centrality of in outside London. I can't remember what this place was called. Enigma
Bletchley
machines,
Park.
Bletchley Park, Enigma machines, and so on. So it seems like there is a desire to speak about a sort of computers is developed through through a necessity through war, but then let loose after the war, and there it's where all starts rolling somehow. But would you say that are there alternative narratives
Yeah.
that is not that doesn't start with ciphers and code breaking?
Yeah. So there definitely are. But like, I just to say a little bit about the ciphers and the code breaking. To me, this is
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting example because, okay, people think of Alan Turing, who helped crack the Enigma code. They think of him as a really good mathematician, which who can argue with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, but also, like, this to me is wildly fascinating that the problem of studying the problem of language, like, does language have statistical frequencies which you can crack according to codes? Like, that gives rise to a lot of this computing technology. So like, already at this Bletchley Park stuff, we're kind of one step away from what today we talk about with large language models,
Mm-hmm.
because large language models and early code breaking are basically about, like, part of what they're about is large scale samples of language, large scale samples of, like, cultural stuff. And then, this notion that maybe there's something in the language, like when you say that a language has a statistical frequency to it, you're on your way to saying the language speaks itself. It has its own, frequency that's not just at letters, but maybe at words, maybe at larger ideas. And so to me, already, even if you say it comes out of the ciphers, then in a way, for me, in a kind of certain esoteric sense, it's not coming out of numbers per se. It's coming out of like speech. And
Mm-hmm.
this notion that computers come out of speech is really interesting. And one of the things when you talk about statistics that I've been really interested in is like, so like the early statistics on the of Markov processes, something that's important for things like Google and large language models. It came from this guy, Andrei Markov, a Russian mathematician, studying the frequency of words or particular letters in Pushkin, right? And so in 1912, to do a study of the frequency and order of Pushkin is also, it's like, this is the great Russian author. It has something to do with establishing the Russian language and its specificity and its peculiarity through mathematics, which and you see it, all these other firms like AT&T, mathematicians at Harvard, psychologists, they're all studying this, mathematical patterns in language. And I think it has something to do with the nation. It also has something to do with a new conception of communication. So I understand that as a cultural and political project, not strictly a mathematical project. But just to put a pin on it, one of the things I write about in my book is that actually you do find that early people developing computers, particularly in the cybernetics movement, they were sometimes organized or brought together or motivated by their dialogues, for example, with Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead, anthropologists of Asia and the Pacific, who were studying Bali, and based on their
Mm-hmm.
work recording and photographing Bali, they started saying, well, maybe there's these underlying systems in society that then provided suggestions for the mathematicians and engineers to start saying, oh, here's what computers are going to be for. They're going to be for deciphering systems, which could be biological, but they could also be engineering, or they could also be cultural. So to me, the birth of computing is, again, it's about this bringing together of a variety of impulses that were partly about dealing with the complexity and integrity of society, of culture, of systems.
But then could one even consider the following, that structuralism in language theory and sort of philosophy is biased in regard to the development of computers, sort of
Yeah.
thinking that counting language would be an opportunity.
Mhm.
So there is a kind of a more or less direct relationship in between.
Yeah, certainly. And I
Yeah.
mean, like one of the things I've been very interested in is right after in the 50s and 60s, you have this rise of what one historian calls high modern social science. So
Mm-hmm.
all these sociology, semiotics, um, new types of functionalist anthropology that are constantly understanding society in terms of systems, feedback, communication. Um, there was in the 60s there was this whole fascination with communication that didn't it wasn't just like popular culture, it was also like it was also across the social sciences and humanities. And so to me it's clear that if computing owes a lot to larger social and political systems, it's also our thinking of society and culture through this high modern social science of the 50s and 60s is deeply indebted to ideas that they were borrowing from computing, that computing sort of had already borrowed from the human sciences. So you end
Mm.
up getting a kind of recursive process where it's not that obviously it's not like anthropology of Bali invents computing, but conceptualization of Bali, conceptualization of computers, conceptualization of language as a systems of science, they're all kind of circulating across the natural and human and technical sciences, and they're frequently shaping the way people talk about their research objects, be they numerical or cultural or whatever.
Mm. I was just recently reading something around the history of authenticity, and not that I'm going to ask you about authenticity, but the question, or it runs like this: the understanding of authenticity is that it relates to Marxist thought. So authenticity as the obverse of alienation,
Okay.
and this is theorized through arts and crafts movements and all through modernism up until the 50s and 60s. In other words, authenticity there is somehow understood as positive and good, relating to a leftist understanding of the world. But then something curious happens in the late 60s and early 70s, where post-structuralism starts to say, well, obviously, if language has no anchoring, or language is performative, therefore language cannot express anything authentic at all. At that moment, the understanding of authenticity departs from its previous understanding.
Yeah.
And then we see further on historically that perhaps instead authenticity has been sort of claimed or co-opted by right-wing understandings as being, from the leftist perspective, understood as a bogus, but speaking about being genuine, being true, true self. Authenticity is stuff that relates to the binary understandings of gender, etc. So now, could we consider that in regard to computing and the sort of in respect to computing, is there some kind of a shift here where, or even a support in regard to, you mentioned Derrida before, who would be some sort of a royalty of the post-structuralists, who would also be addressed as being cynical and demoralizing and whatever, exactly because he proposed that, well, there is no such thing as truth because language is performative. Is there a relationship to computing as well, from a situation of a belief in code as something hard towards a belief or an understanding of code is also always dynamic, relative, performative?
Mhm. Let me
I
just
mean,
think.
maybe it's a too grand question, but maybe we could reflect on it together for a moment.
So, like, one of the things that seems to me really decisive, okay, when
Mm.
uh, the reason you had all these anthropologists kind of associated with computing in its early history, and then the reason you also had um, people like Claude Levi-Strauss, the structuralist anthropologist interested in computing in the 50s, was like you had something that was totally contingent. It did not have to be this way, but history just happened to be the case. Maybe some people would say it's not contingent, but I think it was chance. Computing is coming up at the same time uh, that, say, the Western world is grappling with the fact that indigenous cultures are being decimated. You know what I mean? That we have a new type of global world, and native cultures are increasingly like they are preserved and the reality exists, at least for people like Levi Strauss, is through archives, through books, because the original, I don't know if you say authentic, but the original indigenous culture has been so shattered by modernity that all you can do is assemble the pieces. I think to me, one of these things is that computing is coming up at this moment where people are dealing with the fact that maybe the way in which we encounter culture is through databases. This kind of real culture out there doesn't exist, and uh, like I'm trying to think of how to plug it into. Uh, you could Another way of saying is like um, computing, computing doesn't just help build atom bombs, though it does that. Somehow, like computing belongs to a moment in the world right after World War II, where you're just dealing with the fact that modernity and technology can really destroy things. It can destroy things on a planetary scale, and so this is sort of shaking anthropologists and sociologists' understanding of society. And I think one artifact of that is where people like early structuralists were sort of interested in like, well, let's try to unlock the mathematical and structural systems that have been operating at language, particularly in cultures that are about to be lost. Um, there's sort of a way where people like Derrida and Baudrillard, these post-structuralists, I'm being very simplistic about it here, but they dive headfirst into the idea of like, oh, like maybe everything is an artifact, maybe everything is artificial, maybe like there's something about this an analog to the computer, sort of this notion that they're trying to compare indigenous societies to computing systems tells us something, that the indigenous society is almost in a way already a weird technical artifact, and modernity is a technical artifact. So I don't know if this answers the question, but I mean, like just think about it this way: like again, large language models, and the fact that ChatGPT can, with enough prompting, it can write some interesting things. You know what I mean? Like once you deal with that, like the notion that the power of speech is some innate human capacity and that it's totally natural, it doesn't feel as convincing, because you're like, well, a computer can do it, and a computer was built. And in a weird way, between 1940 and 1970, all of these analogies between culture, society, and computing created a proto large language model. Like, oh, what if we're all just statistical systems and we're all kind of touched by technics, you know? And for fields like anthropology, that was like a really, the funny thing about it is fields like anthropology were trying to overcome racist ideas of like so-called primitive societies being without history and without culture. And so in a weird way, for some anthropologists, and even for someone like Derrida, to put technics at the beginning of culture, including so-called primitive cultures, was also to reject a certain, essentially racist history of natural man turning into modern man. And they start saying, actually, the up and the down and the left and the right, the progress and the non-progress, like it's all confused. It's all just contingent artifacts or something like that.
And in our contemporary times, it seems that the position of the indigenous has sort of flip-sided almost. That today we hear a lot of people saying we need to learn from indigenous populations who live close enough to nature to actually be considered to be authentic. So there's some kind of paradox around here where where now at some point technology and techniques, computers were used or sort of function as a kind of a tool in order to undo forms of racist assumptions.
Yeah.
And towards today, it seems that there's a fear of computers in respect of, and where can we find authenticity? Yes, in the indigenous populations, which I think is already a sort of a recolonial
Yeah.
attitude towards those populations.
Well, that's the thing. So, like, part of what Derrida critiques Levi-Strauss for, and Levi-Strauss is a really important interpreter of cybernetics as well as an
Mm-hmm.
interpreter of indigenous cultures. Um, Levi-Strauss always like structuralism is all about these binary oppositions that get into some type of differential relation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so one of his oppositions was between elementary or so-called primitive societies and modern or complex societies. Uh, and it was this pairing that, out of which Levi-Strauss was producing a kind of intelligibility of the world. And so part of what happens with Derrida when he comes along, he says this opposition itself, like it's not that there's some inherent set of qualities to the indigenous that outside of time and place. Modern man makes his meaning partly by appropriating the figure of the indigenous in new complex ways. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the indigenous becomes a kind of conceptual plaything for Western reason asserting its specificity, right? I think that's part of what Derrida was saying about Levi-Strauss. But one of the things it suggested is like, Derrida was sensitive to two things at once. Okay, on one hand, he adamantly believed there was a history of violence associated with Western reason that, was culturally specific and could not be generalized to all people. It's not like he thought, he clearly thought there were indigenous cultures with their own singularity, but he seemed to also think that he regarded with skepticism the way that people of science invoked the indigenous as as a kind of difference or alternative to our society. And it kind of suggests that indigenous is going to constantly cycle back into philosophical thought, but not necessarily because of the qualities of the indigenous per se, so much as the needs of a particular modernity to define itself or differentiate itself,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In regard to this, indigenous populations, indigenous communities have reflected on our practice of technology. And I take it one step further. Where is spirituality in respect of thought processes and so on regarding technology and its development?
Mm.
If we would think that the 60s and sort of, cyberspace is invented in 1975 by Gibson, which is just after Vietnam War is ending. It is towards the end of the time when cocaine still was something that you took recreationally because of happiness. It is a time where, etc., etc. So, is there sort of could we consider there is a sort of spiritual landscape that is also reflected in the development of computers and development of technology?
So I mean, I think there definitely is. So there's this author at Stanford, Fred Turner.
Mm-hmm.
He's written a lot about, for example, the hippies, particularly when they're interested in like 1960s, going back to the earth, communes and things like that. They were all. It's a little bit similar to Levi-Strauss and Bates and
Mm-hmm.
Mead. Hippies were totally obsessed with microcomputers, cybernetics, um, this idea of like, it's an old, certainly in the U.S. I don't know as much about Europe, but in the U.S. it's this old idea that somehow technology is going to erase society and return us to nature. So, Fred Turner finds in the countercultural, sometimes hippie spiritual guru thinking of the 60s something that is absolutely fixated on technology, partly as
Mm-hmm.
a way of articulating or realizing itself. But the other thing is there's this long tradition in media studies, the field I come from,
Mm,
people, where a lot of scholars also sort of think like um, every single spiritual moment, like it's not for nothing that when you talk about the so-called, three great religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that you call them like, the religions of the book. Do you know what I mean? Like
mm, mm,
they're spiritual systems that are built around an incredible scriptural technology, right?
mm,
And the idea of a spirituality that does not also have techniques, it's almost impossible to imagine.
mm.
Everywhere you find spirituality, you find techniques turning into some type of technology, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe there's a sort of a, I don't know what connection to say indigenous cultures in the South America that managed to build huge structures and have incredible architectures that cannot be accomplished without
Yeah,
technologies or techniques of different kinds.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and then I think the question that like um, I suspect, like, I suspect, I'm not sure, but I suspect what someone like Derrida would want to suggest is like, then, if we're trying to make sense of, if we're trying to, if we're trying to get outside of the violence of Western modernity and so forth, we don't want to look to like indigenous cultures as being a society without technology or something, but you might have a different relationship to technology that's not involved in the same kind of metaphysical violence of, you know, European thought, right? Like you maybe there could be there like there's no way of understanding Western technology without understanding violence. But it's not,
Mm,
it's clear that there could be other types of techniques. That I mean, that's also I guess that's what Yu Kui is interested in his cosmotechnics.
mm-hmm.
Notion that Chinese technology might not be reducible to the same categories and logic of so-called Western technology.
Mm-hmm. Anecdotally, the other day, me and my daughter, who was 5.5, we had ice cream, and she asked me, "Where is the country that is furthest away in universe?" And
Mm.
it was a brilliant question. And then having to explain to her that, well, countries is a notion that humans have. So the furthest away country from where we are in Berlin is maybe Australia or Argentina or something. But there is actually there's no countries on any other planet. And at the same time, we can only conceptualize somewhere else as being part of a country.
Yeah.
But for dogs and for spiders and for whatever, possibly also other human populations on our Earth, we don't understand territory at all in this way, no? So of
Totally.
course, as you say, that it's interesting that with the three body problem that we are watching currently, how how this is one of the questions around territory, balances in between powers, other populations arriving, is exactly, we can't conceptualize otherwise than our territory is under attack. Our our way of life is under attack in regard to ownership and property and whatnot. No, um, and I don't have a following up question to this, but but as you say, it is peculiar how how indeed we cannot, from a Western perspective, we can only understand other forms of relationship to technology and techniques from within our perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's also with the notion of territory, like, I mean, it seems to me um, like it's hard for me to imagine like a modern Western relationship to territory that's somehow not associated with calculation and control. Like the territory is partly how you map something within your domain, where a particular people are said to have some type of sovereignty or rule. In a
Mm,
very practical manner, um, at least in since like the modern and probably the early modern era, but you can also find bits of this in Greece. Like there's no territory without techniques of surveying that are also
mm,
calculating and computing, and gradually, as you move towards the new world, like the United States are increasingly associated with organizing territories like grids, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the US loves grids, like compare New York City's, to London, and you kind of see.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is something like I kind of understand like our notion of territory and certainly our notion of nation or the nation state as a kind of technology of calculation,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense, not necessarily exactly numbers, but a way of reckoning with things, in the fundamental sense of reckoning as calculating. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's sort of hard. Yeah, it's really hard to. Uh, I mean, right? It's so our contemporary world is so technologically driven. It's
Mm-hmm.
really hard to imagine something that isn't somehow identified with technology because we just seem to be. It seems to pervade everything we do, right?
Yeah, no, I mean for sure, but at the same time, I gather that it is also necessary of utmost importance to understand that this way of understanding technology, this way of understanding organization, is also only one of contingently possible and
Yes.
impossible ones.
Yeah.
And as long as we don't, we are also stuck with ways of thinking about extractivist practices, of colonial practices, of ownership, so on and forth.
Yeah.
Um, but how would you say, what happens with the understanding of land with the appearance or the development of GPS and its systems?
Oh boy. Um, what happens to land?
I
Um,
mean, of course, it's not the question that is humongous, but
yeah.
there's something very peculiar how the representation of land, then in regard to territory, of course, when the GPS shows up in your car or whatever, that land is something else from that moment on.
So, one thing that's interesting, like in this historian of science, Bill Rankin references some early geographers writing about this, about how geographic information systems, which are, basically on their way to GPS, an early geographer says, well, they have a kind of pointillistic logic to them. Like the
Mm,
weird thing is, like GPS doesn't really know extension or dimension or things like that. GPS is just a more or less infinite expanse of points
mm,
where you can you can you can designate anything on the planet with unbelievable precision, but the actual problem of finding larger totalities is complex. So like old school geography would draw a picture of a forest and then you would kind of presume there are trees inside of it. Whereas like GIS systems and GPS systems, they can pinpoint like a million trees and then you have to abstract from that to get a forest, right? And so I
mm,
think there's something about GPS where in the way in which it turns the whole world into a set of mathematical points, to me it kind of it evaporates the world, but it does give you something like a globe. Like a globe is just this
mm,
weird spherical phenomenon that exists as a model. It's called the GPS runs on something called WGS 84. It's a model of the shape of the planet. And you can't help but feel like GPS expropriates all real coordinates for kind of mathematical ideals. And like you just know it, like I just know the way I drive is so different since I have GPS. Like I don't know how to get anywhere.
mm.
Like everything is referenced to my phone. My actual attachment to real places is really diminished. Do you know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah. It was very curious. In Brussels, where I lived previously, it seems that educating somebody to drive a taxi takes approximately 8 minutes in comparison to London, where you have to learn the whole. There's this book that you have to learn, right? So, and one of the consequences of this was that quite a lot of taxi drivers in Brussels, wherever you drove from, they drove to a central point from which they took took from which they navigated to your destination.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so they had to sort of deal with a node from which their imagination could sort of develop. But indeed,
Mhm.
with GPS, this completely disappears, right? So we
Totally.
have also very sort of decentralized understanding of where are we in the city with the GPS. So arrondissements or whatever is also vanishing in that respect, that I find quite interesting. But then question would be, we can say that, yeah, so we had the technology, so we could develop GPS, but we could also say somebody wanted GPS to be developed in this way and not in any other way because of political or economical uh, opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I have this in a way that's would be hard to prove empirically, but like, um, so GPS, it's invented by the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's particularly good for navigating planes and boats, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason you need GPS is because, okay, as you know, with the rise of jets, jet propulsion, and ballistic weapons, like war is being fought on a global scale. And
Mm-hmm.
again, World War I in Europe is like a horrible, horrible thing. Like you can't think of a more technologized, violent, whatever. Nonetheless, it frequently was unfolding along trenches in relatively constrained areas where you could see the enemy, and you were fighting in, your backyard or their backyard. In an era of jets and nuclear weapons that are ballistic missiles, war is everywhere and nowhere all at once. Like
Mm-hmm.
it takes what, 12 minutes for the US to drop a bomb on Moscow? And so, in this shrinking down of the planet, you actually need GPS because GPS allows you to pinpoint where things go. You know what I mean? And think that no human brain can master this, no familiarity of the territory can do it. So to me, it's like GPS it seems pretty clear to me that it's a response to particularly technologies of warfare, technologies of global warfare, technologies of destruction. And so the first, although GPS was being used by it was being used by pilots in the 1980s already. But the first
Mm-hmm.
real popular testing of GPS, where lots and lots of people had GPS receivers, it was the first Gulf War. So there were
Mm-hmm.
all of these American soldiers crossing the desert. There was a wide open desert, and they had no idea where they were. They had nothing to orient themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and they all got commercially available GPS units to help that they bought themselves, and I didn't even get them from the military, so that they could navigate around a desert that has no natural landmarks. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's just there. GPS has to be related in some way to like um, imperialism, global warfare, like the ability of people and weapons to go places they've never been, where they don't know anything about landmarks, and like GPS kind of becomes the stable point of reference, this wireframe on which you can hang all knowledge of the planet Earth. You can tie it to this pinpoint and that pinpoint. It's so to me, it's you could have a capitalist GPS, a communist GPS, a fascist GPS, a liberal GPS, but it's still on some level it is a planetary and geopolitical technology of modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so implicitly, GPS technology perpetuates forms of society that we call Western.
Yeah, this is a thing I've struggled with. Okay, everything I've written, like the short answer I think is yes. Like, um, everyone wants, for very, very good reasons, because we don't want to feel like the world is determined and teleological. We always want to imagine, like a whole variety of knowledges and techniques. That there's not one system that globally imperializes everything. But when I look at GPS, when I look at satellites, even when I look at like the high tech infrastructure that shapes global internet systems, It's hard for me not to see a system of Western rationalization that's appropriating the whole surface of the planet, uh, and that is totally comes from some kind of kernel of Western calculation. Um, you can find GPS systems that were developed by China and India and Russia, uh, but they're still operating according to a system of the nation state and its place in a global system. That again, that global system is often kind of Western, right? It's a global network of nation states. Um,
Hmm.
every once in a while, I try to come up with other more complex ways of getting multiple geographies that are existing alongside GPS, and you can find them, right? Like the famous example, of course, is Michel de Certeau. He has this essay
Hmm.
about walking in the city. One is
Hmm.
about like, when you look at when you're at the top of the world, when you're top at the I forget if it's the World Trade Center or the Empire State Building, you just see New York City as a totally rationalized master grid. He says,
Hmm.
but when you walk around the streets, there's actually this way where you create your own spontaneous meaning that doesn't reduce itself to the numerical system. That's like the model. That's one model for overcoming the sense of rationalizing totality. But I don't know. I sort of feel like it's harder and harder to just freely walk the way Dissertot imagined, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's then interesting to negotiate is sort of how I understand Desautour speaks about three kind of dynamics, sort of structural, strategic, and tactical dynamics, where the structure is the same for however much we zoom out, and it is my job to strategically navigate the city in ways that is always political, of course, and then then practice those strategies with tactics that might again be
Yeah.
weird or mystical or whatever. Concerning navigational systems, there was a story that maybe you've heard before that the Swedish military was during the 30 Years' War were at some point extremely successful. They the Germans were completely surprised that they developed techniques of warfare that was incredibly complex and very difficult to understand. And the understanding was they had maps, and that's why they were so
Fascinating. Yeah.
ingenious. However, then later on, somebody started to research this more closely and discovered that yes, they had maps, but they were not of Germany. They fought with maps that over Belgium.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they were so incomprehensible
Oh,
that they
interesting.
actually they were also completely idiotic to themselves, so to say. But so there's something about this sort of they structurally, strategically, and tactically were not merged, no? So what
Yes.
happens when we are using GPS technology is that it looks as at a structure in the sense of a sort of infinitely small entities of a city. Structurally, yes, but it doesn't tell us strategically what we should do about it. But we have a tendency to maybe rely on also the representations that we have in our phone of how streets looks or how the whatever the representation of stuff in our town. But it's then it's interesting to think about how the Swedish military in the 30 Years' War, they were sort of kind of develop a sort of a situationist protocols of situationist artist that was going to London to participate in an exhibition and brought a map of Paris, and they had a great time, except that they never arrived at the museum, but entered places in London that they had absolutely no idea about. Right? And it's quite interesting how and crucial that as scholars, as artists and activists, that our job is to be sort of prefigurative in relationship to how we then utilize these. It's not a matter of saying let's throw away our GPSs, but it's a matter of how do we look at them, how do we understand them, in what do we understand them linearly, or are there diagonal ways of thinking through them. But just before, I know that you have a meeting to run to, just before, in this respect, we talk too much about AI, etc. But for me, there is something interesting about how when I use ChatGPT, when I use image generating AI, it is again with an extremely tight Western model of what I can enter.
Totally.
And then again, I'm curious about how, when I use a certain set of certain processes, what are the search? Where does where are the where are the where are the storages that are used to fish up imagery or segments of text? Because I gather that they are also located in respect of Western forms of cognition and knowledge, no? And not, so there's something in the question for me. It's like how does also AI, with without mentioning all the other difficulties in regard to capitalism and industrial production, and we are without jobs in the future, but how it again homogenizes the world and westernizes us once again.
Yeah. And also, like, it's a, I mean, it comes back to the statistical thing, right? Because so much of what these things do, they're coming up with statistically likely images.
Mm.
But in a way, like, this is because it's statistical likelihood from training data that was assembled over time from particular places. Like, it's also that statistical prediction system is also a very, very specific historical system. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm.
it's just the only thing it can generate is things that are in its data set, and that data set comes from a human cultural history, right? And then,
Mm.
and then so it's going to be totally Western, but then, um, one doesn't necessarily feel more comfortable with the notion where all of our global information systems could capture all societies with equal totality or
Mm-hmm.
equal thoroughness, because that's also a terribly uh,
Yeah,
imperialized
Orwellian or whatever
Orwellian, right? So
phenomena. Yeah.
it's a really damned if you do, damned if you don't
Mm.
situation. Like the old Foucault, visibility is a trap, right?
Mm.
Um, but yeah, it is like AI is totally just like it's this weird cultural engine. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Whereas it's excessively historical. It's excessively cultural in its specifics.
Mm.
It kind of
And
so
at the
it's
same time, perhaps it would be interesting to think about what would Levi Strauss do when he applied for money and he had to mention AI in his application.
oh yeah, totally.
Because maybe there's something about AI right now that its fears are there, but it can possibly also do things that we have absolutely no idea about. It has this sort of this moment of ex, sort of expansion that is perhaps very interesting also to not to not duck and cover, not to fear it, but also take it on, full frontal.
For sure. And I mean, and the like one of the reasons I was so interested with the way historically these philosophers and anthropologists were interested in computing was because I think the world in which computing is just the domain of engineers and venture capitalists, that seems
Mm.
like a troubling world. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Uh, so I'm interested in the idea that like people in humanistic and cultural domains have an expertise that's really at the core of these systems nowadays and that should be flexed. Do you know what I mean? Like
Mm.
anthropologists with their database of historical cultures, might have a lot of insights into ChatGPT that the engineer does not. In the way that
Mm.
ChatGPT has its own databases of culture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and how they are. I mean, I'm thinking about the prompting. Is it very interesting currently of how I can read web pages endlessly of how I should prompt efficiently, but there are
Yeah,
very few web pages that tell me how should I prompt inefficiently or to generate not some sort of Tolkien like fucking images, whatnot. No.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, there's something. I was talking to if you're a professor, right, you're getting more and more essays that look like they've been touched by GPT, to put it euphemistically.
Hmm.
Like, I'm not, honestly, I'm not, I'm not worried or bothered about my students using AI. Uh, but what bothers me is that the AI writing is so bland, so cliched. Do you know what I mean? And it
Hmm.
feels to me like a terrible crutch for thought. Uh, I don't care about who wrote the essay, but I feel sorry for people who think that this is an encounter with the key ideas. You know what I mean? Because it's just all too probable, whatever
Hmm.
comes out of these machines.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, that's also the weird thing, because like, right, like I don't know. To me, it does seem like the Chat GPT, like some of its standard voices, they seem to me very U.S. American. They have a quality of being chipper and upbeat and optimistic. Like where you find this is just like I don't think people. I know Europe. I don't know the whole world. I know Europe reasonably well. I don't know. I know people in America that talk a little bit like ChatGPT, but I don't know anyone in Europe that talks like ChatGPT. It's
No, I think that they feed oxytocin into ChatGPT
yeah,
just before every search, so that it has this sort of positive, kind of promising tone,
yeah,
which I find horrible.
yeah,
To
yeah.
sort of,
It's saccharin. You know what I
yeah,
mean? It's like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
artificial
yeah, yeah.
sugar.
Yeah, no, oxytocin is this hormone that we have all of us have inside, but if you increase it, you become more friendly and you become sort of more sensuous to other peoples and beings and whatever. But something that which is completely out of the territory of conversation, but something that I have started to see in PhD proposals and whatnot is a sense of every every new episode or every new part in the PhD tries to repeat what has just been said, lay out what is to be said, and then saying it.
Yeah.
So spending like half of this PhD is just repeating what you have said and telling us what you will be saying. This I find extremely fucking annoying.
Yeah. I also like, in a way
I
that
just
probably
read the fucking chapter before. I don't need it to be recapitulated. So I think this is a way of a technique to expand your pages as without actually doing any knowledge.
also just some way like it's in a way like it's to me like that is also based on a notion that the thesis is like an information machine and that you're conveying information, whereas people who really are interested in the thesis as an exercise in writing,
Mm-hmm.
like writing tends to meander, and it gives you a complete it's a different thing. So I there's something strangely informational about the bland repetitive thesis, but if you pull yourself into writing as a practice that carries you along, I somehow it takes you away from the notion that a text is informational and instead it's just a journey or something.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm wondering if there's a there's some sort of AI that sort of you write a little content and then you ask the AI to write the introduction to the chapter and the conclusion of the chapter, so that referring to what you have already done and so on. But I think this is very quite irritating how indeed also academic systems has ended up in these sort of, yeah, as you say, providing information rather than engaging the reader in the thought process.
Yes. Yeah. And and a lot of it also has to do with like like kind of informatics is everywhere, and like the metrification, like turning all academic knowledge into things that are measured by national metrics and are trying to
Mm.
get money from the whatever the German Research Foundation or the US NSF or so forth, like all turning knowledge into things that can kind of be measured and counted, and bit by bit the writing starts presenting itself as a way to be counted, and
Mm.
like writing that can be counted has a different weird quality than writing for writing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
uh, yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, and then again, uh, what interests me in regard to, I have no aspirations of being a philosopher or being a scholar. What interests me is how do I get engaged in vis-a-vis a thought process? And that doesn't at all happen in these new forms of informational writings. Totally not.
No, definitely not. I also, I mean, Yeah, I think but in a way, like, I mean, I think academics are really to blame for a lot of this. Like, I think we've been too quick to adjust our teaching methods to try and accommodate um, what we think is the world around us. Um, I don't think, like, I do a lot of teaching, but I don't spend a lot of time teaching, like, my students that what they're doing is writing. I teach them how to organize and present data.
Hmm.
And I sort of, so I can see how I know I'm to blame for this in a very small way. And I think it's pretty widespread that those of us who are teaching people to think are sometimes ourselves not teaching certain ways that, would be meaningful.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But I think for me, what was particularly stimulating with reading your book was this sense of I don't know where around what would present itself around the next corner.
Yeah.
So that
That's nice.
the book is not there to confirm my knowledge, but rather to in a way unsettle
Yeah.
what I have, what I consider for granted, or what I understand. Bletchley Park, and that was it. But
Yeah.
the ways that you celebrate certain thinkers, certain sociologists or philosophers, and other ones that is somehow missing or not understood in the ways that they are normally done. This, I think, is a sign of proper scholarly activities. So thank you very much for offering this book to us readers.
My pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, totally. Okay, Bernie, you got to go to a meeting. It's
Yes.
very important that you're in time. I probably should have lunch.
Great. Thanks for
Yeah.
talking.